I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. We've been off for the past 2 weeks, both for the Thanksgiving holiday, but also because it's one of the busiest times of the year here at the Book Review, as we put together our 2 big year-in-review projects, the 100 Notable Books of 2023 and the 10 Best Books of the Year. On the show this week, we're talking about the latter, the 10 Best Books. It's physically impossible to fit 8 people into one of the audio recording studios here at the Times. Even if we could, it would be slightly chaotic. So we've broken it up into 2 conversations in which editors from the Book Review each discuss one of the books on the list, as well as one title that they wish had made it. Now, thousands of books are published every year here in America. So how do we choose a mere 10? Well, briefly put, it's almost a year-long conversation here at the Book Review. Starting in the spring, we meet every month to talk about books that we think might be worth discussing for the year-end list. And then once fall hits, it turns into longer, weekly meetings. There are discussions and debates and, once in a while, arguments. And by the time Halloween rolls around, we have a series of votes, and all of a sudden we have the 10 best books of the year. It's pretty democratic. It's pretty representative of this group of editors and critics here at the Book Review. Now, what does best mean? Well, to state the obvious, it's pretty subjective, of course. It can't help but be. There are a lot of year-end lists out there, and I think that we here at the Book Review collectively read more than almost anyone else out there. And again, collectively as a group, these are the ones that we alighted on. So when we talk about best, we think about many things. We look at the writing and the language. If it's fiction, is there a narrative drive? Is it surprising? If it's nonfiction, is there new information to be had? Does the book move us? Does it dazzle us? Can we not stop thinking about it? So those are a few of the things that we think about when we're trying to make these decisions. But enough explanation. Here are the New York Times Book Review's 10 best books of 2023. In fiction, we have Eastbound by Maylis de Kerangal, translated from the French by Jessica Moore. The Fraud by Zadie Smith. The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. And Northwoods by Daniel Mason. In nonfiction, we have Fireweather, a true story from a hotter world by John Vaillant. Master Slave Husband Wife, an epic journey from slavery to freedom by Ilyon Wu. Some People Need Killing, a memoir of murder in my country by Patricia, Evangelista. The Best Minds, a story of friendship, madness, and the tragedy of good intentions by Jonathan Rosen. And Bottoms Up and the Devil Laughs, a journey through the deep state by Kerry Howley. Let's hear about all these books. I'm now joined by a quartet of book review editors to discuss the first of our best books of the year. Emily Aiken.
Hello.
Greg Coles.
Hi, Gilbert.
Liz Egan.
Hi.
And Sadie Stein.
Hi.
Thank you all for being here. And I think I'd like to start with one of the books that gave me so much pleasure this year because of who wrote it, when it was set, and who it was about. Greg, you're on the hook for talking about this one. Tell us about The Fraud.
Happily, I loved it too. I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'll tell you why I like it so much. The Fraud by Zadie Smith is a historical novel. It's set in Victorian London, so the mid-1800s, the era of Charles Dickens. And it is itself a vast Dickensian novel that pulls together various narrative strands, chiefly through the character of Eliza Touchet. She is a widowed Scottish housekeeper who lives and works in the household of a popular but mediocre novelist named William Ainsworth. Ainsworth and Eliza actually existed, by the way. A lot of this story and its outline are drawn from the historical record. Ainsworth is the cousin of Eliza's late husband, which is how she comes to be working there. And he is himself a widower who has recently gotten remarried to his former maid, Sarah. So Eliza has to contend with the shifting class dynamics and reversals of fortune that you would expect in any good Dickensian novel. And, oh, by the way, we learn early on that Eliza was at one time romantically involved, not only with Ainsworth, but also and separately with his late wife, Fanny. So it's a little chaotic, this household. It's a little bit of a psychological minefield for poor game Eliza, who is a marvelously determined character who soldiers on following her own compass needle. All of this is context and background for the novel's second narrative strand, which is a trial that captures the public's imagination and provides much of the book's forward momentum. A nobleman named Sir Roger Tichborne was lost at sea and presumed drowned years before, but now suddenly a man has stepped forward claiming to be the missing Sir Roger and laying claim to his vast property and fortune. It's a preposterous claim. The man is patently a fraud, but somehow he becomes a cause célèbre with fervent support from huge swaths of the public, mostly among the working class. So again, there's this theme of class division and reversal of fortune, and also a kind of emotional and anti-intellectual populism that has clear echoes in today's politics. Ainsworth's wife, Sarah, is obsessed with the case. She's a firm believer in the claimant's story, and against Eliza's better instincts, she also starts to get drawn in as an observer. And that leads us to the novel's third strand, because the character who interests Eliza most in all of this is a formerly enslaved Jamaican named Andrew Bogle, who served as valet for the real Sir Roger, but is now testifying on behalf of the obvious fraud. Bogle is dignified and reserved, he's smart and self-possessed, and he fascinates Eliza because she can't figure out his motives in propping up the claimant. And through her interest in him, we get to look at the horrors of slavery and family separation on Jamaica's sugar plantations.
This was one of the first big novels that came out this fall. It came out right after Labor Day, the Tuesday after Labor Day. So we've been talking about it many months. Aside from the wonderful summary of all the plot strands that you just gave, briefly, what was it about this book that really drew you in?
One of the things I love about this book is that it's such a suitable container for Zadie Smith's very specific talents. I have liked most of her novels, but until this one, I've generally preferred her nonfiction. Zadie Smith is one of the great literary critics of my generation. And maybe as a result of that, she always seems to be stepping into somebody else's shoes when she writes a novel. She's done E.M. Forster. She's done Virginia Woolf. She's, of course, done Dickens even before this. And you get the feeling that the novel as a form is both a playground and a battleground for her. It's a chance for her to test her ideas about novel writing. She's good at it. She's a good mimic. We all read this book, and many of us also listened to it on audiobook at the same time because she's a good vocal mimic as well as a good literary mimic. She writes smart and entertaining books, but I often find myself asking, where is Zadie in this? In a way that I don't in her criticism. And that's not an issue for me in this book, partly because it's a book explicitly about novel writing, which plays organically to her strengths.
Zadie, I feel like this is a book that you, for many reasons, would naturally gravitate towards. Why did you like The Fraud?
Like Greg, I think I liked this better than any of Zadie Smith's novels. I think this is really the culmination of a lot of things we've wanted from her. And I love Dickens. So it was going to be hard to impress, actually, although it, of course, did appeal to me. And I think she totally knocked it out of the park. And it's an homage without being too much of a pastiche. And it's accessible, but it's also, it feels faithful. It's fun. It's irreverent. But she also is respectful of the source material and really knows it. And that makes such a difference, I think.
It's such a clever book, but the thing I want to underscore is just how playful it is. There are so many frauds in this book. There is the claimant, the man who is impersonating a rich scion, but also the fraud that is history. So Zadie Smith's making a lot of sort of serious claims about the way the empire, the British Empire, has been presented, who's been left out of that story, the enslaved people in Jamaica on the plantations who actually fund the empire, and, of course, women. And we have Eliza Touchet, who's just a figure. She's the superior writer. Her cousin Ainsworth is the novelist who's met with some success, but she's the talent in the family. And Zadie Smith's just having a blast telling us about these people who get left out of the canvas of history.
If you like Dickens, if you like historical fiction, if you like stuff set in London, it's just one of the more pleasurable reading experiences I've had this year. And Greg, you're absolutely right. If you are an audiobook person, you should definitely listen to this on audiobook. We had Zadie Smith on the podcast earlier this year, and Sarah Lyle talked to her a bunch about what it was like to not only read the book, but to act the book out with all the different accents that are involved. It's very fun.
Yeah, you get the feeling she probably delivered great bedtime stories to her kids.
Zadie, you have our second book today. It's a piece of narrative nonfiction about climate change. What book are you talking about?
I am talking about Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world by John Vaillant. To very much change lanes, this is the story of the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire. And Fort McMurray was the petroleum hub of Canada and, in fact, America's biggest foreign supplier. And this wildfire, which happened early in the season while there was still ice floating on the nearby lake, was so catastrophic that within 2 hours, flames had destroyed 150 acres of forest and almost 90,000 people have been driven from their homes. Needless to say, it cost billions of dollars in damages. But as vivid and cinematic an account as this is of one conflagration, and it is, and as good a thriller as it is, and it really is as good a thriller as I read this year, what makes the book very important and timely and really scary is its larger message, which is that this is going to keep happening. Because the perfect storm of factors that led to this particular fire, which is to say atmospheric heat, dryness of the forest floor, but also the suburban sprawl, much of which is built from highly flammable petrochemical materials, aren't unique at all. And as we have seen the past summer, this is going to keep on happening.
Zadie, what about the people who were living nearby when the fire started?
Well, one thing that is amazing about this book, in which the author does so well, is that he simultaneously has kind of a cast of hundreds of people who appear, who are fighting the fire, who are investigating climate science, who are adjusting the insurance, and of course, who are fleeing. But at the same time, the main character, strange as it sounds, is the fire itself, which really almost becomes an antagonist, a living being. Early on, he says, is fire alive? And that's one of the animating questions. And in his hands, it is. I mean, he's a writer who has been in his career interested in the intersection of kind of the natural and human worlds. And this is a spectacular collision. And who is the more compelling, the human characters or the fire itself, is just one of the threads that keeps it riveting.
What if you're not somebody who usually reads books about climate and science and mining, any of the subjects?
Absolutely. The petroleum industry.
Right.
This is a book that I think could and did appeal to a lot of people. And I think not everyone on the desk would be automatically attracted to the story of a wildfire by any means, but we all came to agree, I believe, that this was very worthwhile and very entertaining, too.
It's written almost like an action-adventure thriller. It's got very fast, propulsive language, especially at the beginning when he's laying all the high stakes out. And once he hooks you with that, then he kind of backs up and makes room to explain the science and the climate catastrophe that's happening.
You can read it as a piece of climate journalism, certainly nature journalism, history of climate science in a way, of the petroleum industry, which is fascinating. But you can also just read it as a yarn. And it was also a strange fact that I think a lot of us were reading it just as the ash and smoke of this summer's Canadian wildfires were blanketing New York City and large parts of America. And so it felt really apocalyptic and vivid and acted as a very useful explainer.
We are going to move to Emily, who's going to talk about the first of two books that she'll be stumping for in this segment here. Emily, you are here to talk about The Best Minds, which I feel like from early in the year was a book that many people on the desk were very enthusiastic about, despite the fact that it's a very sad book.
That's absolutely true. I think it's fair to say there was real immediate consensus around this book and its merits. The book is The Best Minds, A Story of Friendship, Madness, and the Tragedy of Good Intentions by Jonathan Rosen. It's a work of nonfiction. Rosen has published both novels and other works of nonfiction, but this book, which is a deeply personal story for him, feels like the book he was always meant to write. It's an intimate portrait of a friendship that ended with a terrible tragedy. And at the same time, it's this ambitious, panoramic cultural history of America in the last few decades of the 20th century, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And specifically, it's a look at how we as a culture have dealt with serious mental illness. And it's clear we've not dealt with it very well. So I want to talk a little bit about the friendship. The book begins with Jonathan Rosen's arrival in New Rochelle, a suburb of New York City. He's 10 years old. He arrives in this neighborhood, and right away he meets a boy his age who lives down the hill. That boy is Michael Lauder, and they have a lot in common. They're both super smart. They're into books. They're funny. They're at the top of their class. In fact, they're both going to go to Yale together after high school. Both their dads are college professors, and both their families are Jewish. Even at 10, Michael is already remarkable. As Jonathan puts it in the first chapter, Michael often seemed like someone who had lived a full span already and was just slumming it in childhood, or living backward like Benjamin Button or Merlin. And right there you get a sense of the voice in this book. It's wry, it's tender, it's conversational. This is a book about a tragedy, but it's also very funny. It's self-mocking. As one of our colleagues put it, I think she said, it contains the whole gamut of human emotions. The first 150 pages are devoted to establishing this friendship between Jonathan and Michael. And we continue through college where Jonathan and Michael drift apart. Michael continues this path of the golden boy. He graduates from Yale in 3 years, summa cum laude. He gets a high-paying job as a consultant. He then decides to go to law school, gets in everywhere, and then tragedy. He has a psychotic break. He ends up in a mental institution with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He eventually convinces Yale Law School to let him go back, and he becomes a kind of poster boy for the high achiever who happens to have a serious mental illness. He's a kind of icon for the movement of destigmatization. The New York Times writes a glowing article about him, calling him a genius. He gets a book contract to write a memoir. Hollywood comes calling, gives him $1 million to make the story of his life into a film, and he starts dating another Yale graduate named Kerry Costello. It looks like a succession of triumphs, but as Jonathan Rosen shows in the book, Michael is in fact quite sick. Every day in law school, for example, he's waking up convinced that his room is on fire. He's constantly battling hallucinations and delusions. And these delusions eventually lead him to commit a horrific crime, which Rosen handles with great sensitivity in the book. But the crime isn't really his focus. We know from the outset that it is going to happen. And his interest is in why, given Jonathan's symptoms, his diagnosis, his treatment, why did it happen at all? And so we get his critique of American psychiatry, which is damning, but never less than sympathetic.
Emily, as I'm one of the people who was an early champion of this book, I absolutely loved it. And as you were talking, I was thinking, I cannot name another memoir of a friendship between two men. I think of Truth and Beauty by Anne Patchett, which is about a lost friendship between women. But one thing I really loved about The Best Minds is the story of this incredible connection that these two kids had growing up as neighbors and running up and down the hill to each other's houses.
It's a real balancing act to write a two-hander like that, to presume to write someone else's story. And he pulls it off tonally in a way that is unusual.
All the more impressive given the nature of that larger story and how salacious it could have been. When you talk about exploitative, this is a true crime story, and yet he doesn't make that the bigger part of it. It's one part of it. Reading this, I've read other Jonathan Rosen books, and I thought, I can't believe he had this story all this time and wrote those other ones first. This seemed like such rich material for a writer to mine. But I'm glad that he waited because he does it so delicately.
I understand that it took him years. He may have been working on this for a decade.
Last year, one of our 10 best books of the year was a book called Strangers to Ourselves by Rachel Aviv, which was a series of kind of case studies of mental illness and ways of approaching, ways of the stories we tell about mental illness. And this book fits seamlessly in with that one. This could have been one of her case studies just expanded to book length. Everything that I loved about her book, I love equally about this one.
Liz Egan, you are on the hook for our next book.
The book I would like to tell you about is Master, Slave, Husband, Wife by Ilyon Wu. In 1848, Ellen and William Craft, an enslaved couple in Georgia, made a daring escape north as a sickly young white planter and his male slave. Ellen dressed as a wealthy white man, stovepipe hat, dark green glasses, wearing a sling over her right arm as a sort of alibi for her illiteracy. Improbably, despite close calls with slave catchers, bouncing from train to steamboat to stagecoach, the pair arrived in Philadelphia, where freedom was more complicated than you'd expect. The Crafts kept moving. They went on to Boston, to Halifax, and later to England. They joined the abolitionist speaker circuit, and they also told their own story in a book called Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, which Ilyon Wu first encountered decades ago as a graduate student. And the Crafts' story stuck with her, to say the least. In Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, she fills in some of the missing pieces from that original account. She focuses on the sights, the sounds, the smells, the unimaginable stakes that the Crafts were up against, and also, perhaps to me, the most significantly, the Crafts' love story. So even in the midst of this incredible stress and the highest of stakes, as I said, you really see the connection between the two of them. Master, Slave, Husband, Wife is meticulously researched. It's told in novelistic and poetic detail, and with sympathy and insight and a momentum that matches the Crafts' journey. I can tell you very simply what really sold me on this book. It was one of the first books I read in 2023. And when you open the book, on the end papers, there are pictures of a series of people. I flipped by these pictures very quickly. I didn't think anything of them. And then when I turned the last page of the book, there were pictures of the same people. They were matching papers at the beginning and the end. And I realized when I looked at the pictures of the people at the back of the book, I knew exactly who they were. And they were these old-timey photos of the Crafts and other people they ran into along their journey. And thanks to Ilyon Wu, I felt I had a very clear sense of who they were. And the final thing I want to say about Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, I was a little skeptical when I first heard about this book because knowing that the Crafts had already written their own story, I wondered, why do we need to read it from somebody else's viewpoint? And given what Ilyon Wu fills in and all the detail that she weaves into this story, after visiting many of the places the Crafts passed through and looking at historical documents from that time, I felt that she turns up the volume on their voices. So not only do you recognize their pictures, but you really feel that you can hear them. And throughout the year, anytime I picked up a book, I was comparing it against this yardstick.
Absolutely agree, Liz. One of the things that really struck me about the book is you're talking about the novelistic detail. There's a kind of rare immediacy in this book for a work of historical nonfiction. She's recreating this journey, but as you say, it's as if she's synthesized all of this historical research about every town, every mode of transportation from the steamship to the train, because of course enslaved people weren't even allowed to sit inside the train. So William is sitting in a kind of coal car, I think, at certain points outside. So she's recreated this with incredible felicity, but the way she recounts the story, we're inside the consciousness of the couple, and we're seeing the world through their eyes. And it's an extraordinarily readable book.
It almost reads like a thriller.
Emily, I feel like from the beginning of the year, this was a book that you were really advocating for. I believe it was one of the earliest covers of the print book review in 2023. And clearly, 11 months later, you still feel like it is a keeper.
I do. I preview a fair amount of historical nonfiction, not history, works of history. And Ilyon Wu has just brought a very, very rare touch to her material. She obviously had a great story, one that should be better known. And one of the appealing things, of course, we should underscore that this is a story with a relatively happy ending. An enslaved couple made a daring, high-risk escape, and they succeeded. But she does so much more with their story.
Liz, I'm glad you brought up the fact that it was a love story, too, because I feel over and over again this year, we found ourselves drawn in one way or another to stories that had a certain warmth and heart, even in unlikely places. And I think that's not incidental to why so many of us co-facted with this book, which is, of course, a very good work of history as well, that has an unusual narrative heart and relationship at its core.
Yeah, you don't expect, I always am looking for a love story. I'm a little bit of a romantic. I certainly did not expect to come to this book and find this connection between these people. Of course, the way that they were able to navigate all the risks that they did was by working together. They only prepared for this journey for 4 days. The journey from Macon to Philadelphia took 4 days. And by then they'd been working on this only for 8 days. So you can imagine the connection between the two of them to pull that off. Intense.
Emily, you have a wonderful and wonderfully short piece of fiction that happens to also take place on a train here to talk about.
Exactly. So the book I'm going to talk about is Eastbound by Maylis de Kerangal. And there are two things I want to say right away about the book that make it a little unusual for our list. And the first is that it is a work in translation. De Kerangal is a French writer. She's written nearly a dozen books, though very few of them have been translated into English. She's won several prizes in France. And Eastbound was published in France in 2012, but it's only coming out here this year in English. And the second thing to say about Eastbound is that it is a novella. In this beautiful English language edition, gorgeously translated by Jessica Moore and published by the Archipelago Press, the whole book comes in at something like 125 pages. But boy, does de Kerangal pack a lot into those pages. One critic described the book as a tale told in a single breath, which I loved. And at the book review, I think it's fair to say we were dazzled by the way the author creates this whole world and sucks us into it with not a wasted word. The entire story does take place on a train, the famous Trans-Siberian Railway. And on this train are 100 Russian conscripts who are under the control of a sadistic sergeant. They're traveling from Moscow to an army base in the east, so they haven't been told their final destination. All we know is what the book's title tells us. They are eastbound. And one of these conscripts is our protagonist, an unworldly 20-year-old named Alyosha, who really doesn't want to be on this train or in this army. But he's poor and he doesn't have connections, so he was unable to avoid the draft. And within a few pages, he gets beat up by some toughs, some fellow soldiers, and he becomes more determined than ever to get out, to escape. But getting off the train without getting caught is nearly impossible. He tries a couple times and fails. And in desperation, when a French woman boards the train, he persuades her to hide him in her compartment. Now, Alyosha and this French woman, Hélène, don't speak the same language. They literally cannot communicate in words. But it turns out they have something profound in common because Hélène is also trying to escape something. In her case, it's a relationship with a Russian man whom she's followed to Siberia, but now is getting cold feet about that. So she's hopped on a train. And so we have this unlikely couple, and together they form this uneasy, fascinating complicity. All this happens in the first 40 pages. De Kerangal is a master at building suspense. So the book, like the train you're on, propels us through time and space, homing in on this question of escape. Will the cruel sergeant and his minions find Alyosha before he can get off the train? Will Hélène be able to protect him, or will she betray him? This book is not only a sort of miniature masterpiece of narrative tension and compression, it's also memorably cinematic. De Kerangal captures the claustrophobic closeness of the train cars and the compartments, teeming with passengers, all with different agendas and objectives, with the same level of detail that she evokes the landscape, this vast Siberian forest and lakes and sunsets that we encounter outside the train window.
The fact that this book is about Russia, I think, was part of our discussion. I think, having only done this for 2 years, it's whether or not something has resonance now only plays a part in whether or not we think it belongs on the 10 best books of any given year. But it feels like it did play a part in our selection of this book.
I have to say, I was astonished to discover that the book had been written more than 10 years ago because of course, it felt so timely. It felt like we were in a train full of soldiers headed for Ukraine. And in fact, I think it was written just before Chechnya. And I mean, unfortunately, we have a martial country in Russia that is frequently going to war. But yes, I think we all felt this kind of urgency and relevance about the book, as beautiful and timeless as it also is.
Yeah, I think the timelessness is one of the really neat things about this book because it really could be, I won't say a 19th century Russian. The length alone disqualifies it for that. But it's in the grand tradition, right, of this Russian tradition, of the idea of the East and of Siberia specifically. And that conjures up such a vast literary landscape. And then she does it in such an exquisite, economical way. And I think that's part of the achievement of it. I'm so glad you said cinematic, too, because it really felt almost nouvelle vague. You could picture it shot for shot. You almost don't want it adapted because you have such a perfect idea of what the film would be in your mind, and it would be irritating if it departed at all. And we probably all have slightly different films in mind. I'm a sucker for a short, exquisite book. Yeah, and yet they are quicker to read, that's true. But when they're so hard to do well, and when it's done this well, it's really special.
I'd love to just put in a plug for the physical object of this book. Given the volume of reading that we do for best books, I have taken to listening to a lot of them. But Eastbound, I know that the audiobook is wonderful, but the physical book is a smaller trim size, and it has this very appealing feel in your hand. It's just a beautiful package of a book. I don't love that term about books, packages, but it is worth getting your hands on.
Agreed. That Archipelago French flap is really good.
So before we go around the horn and ask each of you to talk about a book that you wish had made the list, I'm going to mention one final book here that is one of our top 10 books of the year. And I believe our critic, Jennifer Salai, who will be on a critics roundtable next week, will speak a little bit more at length about this book. But I just wanted to get it in here to make sure we mention all of them in some way. This is Some People Need Killing, a memoir of murder in my country. It's by Patricia Evangelista. And Evangelista is a reporter from the Philippines, and she writes about the drug war that was waged by President Rodrigo Duterte against his own citizens. He served as the president for 6 years, and under him, thousands of extrajudicial killings of suspected drug dealers or suspected drug addicts were committed by vigilantes or hit squads that were essentially sanctioned by the government. And Evangelista writes about covering those deaths, which it seemed at least were constant, like multiple deaths were happening every day that she was covering this story. She writes about those deaths and what it was like to cover them in real time. And again, Jen is going to hopefully talk about this more at length, but I briefly want to quote her review because it gets across what I think this book does well. So Jen writes, quote, in her book, Evangelista makes us feel the fear and grief that she felt as she chronicled what Duterte was doing to her country. But appealing to our emotions is only part of it. What makes this book so striking is that she wants us to think about what happened too. She pays close attention to language, and not only because she is a writer, language can be used to communicate, to deny, to threaten, to cajole. Duterte's language is coarse and degrading. Evangelista's is evocative and exacting. And I believe that brings this segment to a close. But before I do so, I have to ask all of you to put in a plug for a book that you were particularly passionate about that did not make the top 10 books of 2023. I'm going to start to my right. Greg.
I'm going to cheat and name two. The first book, had we been able to include more than 10 books on the list, I would have loved to see Birnam Wood by Eleanor Catton. It's a novel by a New Zealand author, previous winner of the Booker Prize. This is a sprawling novel about eco-terrorists and a billionaire fighting for the same piece of land. It gets apocalyptic at the end. It's a lot of fun. Good novel. Birnam Wood by Eleanor Catton. The second book, also by a non-American author, is named Kairos. It's by a German novelist named Jenny Erpenbeck. It tells a love story between a 19-year-old woman and a novelist in his mid-50s, set against the reunification of Germany, the fall of East Germany, the reunification of Germany. It's a love affair against world affairs. It is written in a kind of spare, intimate style that just carries you right along.
All right. Thank you, Greg, Birnam Wood, and Kairos. Liz, what do you got?
Day by Michael Cunningham. This is a novel that unfolds in 3 Aprils, April 2019, April 2020, and April 2021. It begins in a Brooklyn brownstone occupied by a husband and wife, their son and daughter, and the wife's brother, who is the beloved nerve center of the family. As his sister's marriage crumbles, he is planning to move out and get a place of his own. And then it's April 2020, and the family is in deep lockdown. We're in the loneliest time of the pandemic. Robbie is no longer living there. And then it's April 2021, and I can't tell you what happens then, but I will tell you that this is a domestic drama. It's beautifully told. It has some very funny moments and very sad moments. It appealed to me because I love seeing what other families were up to during those times when we didn't see anybody except the people we were locked down with. And I think you should all read it.
You love stories about families.
I do. I can't get enough of them.
That is Day by Michael Cunningham. Emily?
I'm going to plug a book that couldn't be more different. It's a work of nonfiction. It's called The Rigor of Angels by William Egginton. This book is by a humanities scholar at Johns Hopkins, and it's quite original and ingenious. He does something very unlikely. He brings together 3 incredibly different people: the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and the German theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg. And he shows us that from their very different perspectives, times, and places, they shared an intuition that our basic understanding of reality, especially the way we conceive of space and time in this kind of flowing continuum, does not correspond to how things really are. In other words, there's a gap between our perception of reality and the laws it obeys. This is a heady book, but Egginton understands that, the challenge, and he combines some abstract philosophy and some difficult science with these really appealing vignettes and a lot of storytelling and biographical portraiture.
Emily, why am I not surprised that you're recommending a heady book? This is so heady. Thank you, Emily. That is The Rigor of Angels by William Egginton. Zadie, you are going to take us out.
I am so excited to tell everyone to read this 800-page saga, Lies and Sorcery by Elsa Morante, written in the 40s, but first translated fully in English this year by the wonderful Jenny McPhee. And it is so good. Imagine, if you will, the luxury of 800 pages of Ferrante before Ferrante. It's a saga, a multi-generational saga of the women in one family. There's so much madness. There's so much betrayal. There's so much heartbreak. It is lurid. It's tinged with magical realism. It's beautiful to read. It is, if you are looking for a cozy, cold weather read, something to get you through to the spring, this is what you are looking for. It will bring you so much pleasure and delight. I cannot believe this was not in our lives before. And now everyone has this incredible treat to look forward to if they're willing to invest a few hours. Lies and Sorcery by Elsa Morante.
The wonderful thing about the top 10 books process here at the Book Review is that it is a collective effort, but it's also wonderful to hear each of you give your individual picks for books that you were enthusiastic about this year. Sadie Stein, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Emily Aiken, you're the best.
Thanks, Gilbert.
Liz Egan, come back.
Thank you. I will.
Greg, you're sitting next to me.
Always a pleasure.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm now joined by three more editors from the Book Review. Lauren Christensen. Hello, Lauren.
Hi, Gilbert.
MJ Franklin. Hi, MJ.
Hello, hello.
And Jumana Khatib. Jumana!
Hi, Gilbert. Always a pleasure.
Thank you all for being here. We're here to talk about some more of the top 10 books of 2023. And we are going to start with a book that MJ is very excited to talk about. MJ, over to you.
Yes, I'm excited to talk about Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is a searing social satire of our justice system, but staged through this incredibly brutal story. The book imagines a world where death row inmates are able to fight to the death on national television for a chance at freedom. Imagine if Gladiator were streamed on ESPN and that was embraced by the culture, almost like football and the NFL. We follow two women who are incredibly fierce competitors, strong, almost unbeatable. Because they're still alive when we follow them, they are unbeatable warriors, and they are teammates, and they are lovers. So a lot of complicated dynamics there. And then they are on the cusp of freedom, and then the rules of the game change. And I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil anything. But through this story, we get a look at what it's like to be in this system. And then the book pans out and you follow a host of characters in this world. You follow a sports anchor who is supposed to be commentating on some of the games. You follow protesters who are protesting the sport. You follow some of the people who are victims of some of these inmates. And so you get this kind of like robust world, but it's all anchored by this commentary, which is, what does our justice system look like? And what goes too far? How do we embrace brutality as a culture? This book is looking at like redemption and what justice actually means. It's doing so much. But why I love it is because it's combining two things. It's combining this incredibly thoughtful social commentary with what is essentially an action blockbuster. And this book is fast-paced, high-octane. The fight scenes are vivid and brutal, but there's a depth and an accessibility to this title that I think makes it incredible. Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah is also the author of Friday Black, a story collection that came out, I think, 5 years ago in 2018. And I still think about stories from that collection every single day. He is a singular talent with such a vision and a voice. And I can't imagine this book coming from anyone else. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in addition to like the tools of fiction being used to explore this social issue, there are also many footnotes throughout the book that kind of tie in real-world facts, real-world anecdotes, etc. And so you get lost in this story, but you never forget just the stakes that this idea has in our very own lives. So I loved this book. I couldn't put it down when I started reading it. I recommended it to everyone, including an attendant who was helping me when I broke my phone. And then I was recommending books, and I recommended one, and you could tell he was flagging. And then I started talking about this one, and he perked right up, and he was like, "Can you remind me of the title? I'm going to buy this." And so it's incredible. Make sure it's on your reading list. And I am one of those people that just starts yelling about books in public places, whether you ask to or not. So sorry about that, but also not sorry.
You work at the right place, MJ. I think the three of you all read Chain Gang All-Stars. Lauren, what were your thoughts?
I second everything that MJ said. I mean, I think the energy of the book was what really grabbed me the most. It really stood out in this book compared to a lot of the other books that we read, other ones we loved, but this one just really had a pace that really never let you go until the end. I think it's, on top of being a thriller and a really horrifying picture of violence, I think it's also a really beautiful love story, which I guess you would assume those would be competing tones, and he just pulls it off so beautifully. So, second.
Lauren, I agree. I didn't mention that enough, but the love story here, that's what kind of animates this book. You're so rooting for these two characters who are in love, and they're trying to figure out, like, how do we stay together and how do we be in this incredibly unjust system that is posing as justice. And like, they feel so strongly for each other, and through their love, we as readers feel so strongly through them.
Love a good tortured love story.
But too, like, the love story is what makes the book, I don't want to say, it's what makes the circumstances bearable for them, and I think for us, because there are so many moments. And also, I want to say for anybody who likes audiobooks that this might be a great option. It's read by a full cast. It's incredible. This is the book that converted me to audiobooks. But anytime that the story begins to really build in grotesquerie or just suffering, then there are these moments when you pull back and you remember they are having such beautiful and tender moments. And that's really, I think, what gives the story part of its energy. Is this is the motor that keeps the book going. It's probably one of the most moving love stories I've read this year. I can't think of anything else that compares. So.
Which is funny because it's like, this is a story about gladiators fighting to the death. And we're like, yeah, it's the most moving love story of 2023.
Another book to me that had just a ton of energy, but in just the most different way. I cannot tell you how different these two books are, was a book that Jumana is going to talk about. It's probably one of the last books on our list of 10 that I read this year, and it's not a short book. I picked it up. I was a little bit hesitant because I didn't know that I had time for a 600 some odd page book, but as soon as I started, I could. It's very weird to say this about a family saga, but I could not put it down, and I'm excited to hear you talk about The Beasting, Jumana.
Oh, yes. Honestly, I've probably spent half this year talking about The Beasting. This is by Paul Murray. I actually don't remember when I first read it, but I remember how it felt. So this is a big, classic, formal family story. It follows the Barnes family in Ireland. They are headed up by a Dickie and Imelda, and they have two adolescent kids, PJ, who's about 12, and his older sister, Kath, who's about to get ready to go to university. Dickie runs a car dealership that he took over from his father. Dickie hates selling cars, would rather be in his office reading than working the floor, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about Dickie. Although that's not true. Dickie has secrets that I could never have imagined when I started this book. And they are in the throes of the 2008 crash. So they were once quite prosperous, quite enviable. And now Imelda is frantically selling off furniture and jewelry and things on Facebook Marketplace and eBay to just try and make ends meet. She's taking a bucket to bail themselves out, but they're going underwater, and it's obvious. This book has a pretty amazing structure in the sense that he gives you 4 sections that are devoted to the perspective of each of those principal characters, and then he brings them back together. And each section feels incredibly lived in. He's such a precise writer that everybody has her own demotic or her own way of thinking, her own cadence, right? The most notable example of this is going to be in Imelda's section, which is my favorite. This is written in a stream of consciousness, Molly Bloom style. So I'm going to tell anybody in advance, if you're accustomed to seeing punctuation marks or paragraph markers on the page, you've got hundreds of pages to brace yourself, and it's so worth it. But he's also a very warm writer. He has so much affection for his characters. He's so funny. You feel completely on everybody's side as their story is unfolding. I loved it. I've been frothing at the mouth about this novel. I'm delighted to be talking about it. And I haven't even read Skippy Dies, which is what I think that most people know Paul Murray for. That's about a boarding school, a boys' boarding school. And that's something I can't wait to read later this year.
Jumana, I do remember how much you loved this book. And the word that I think of when I think of this book is the word charming. There's something so charming about this family that just wins you over. And I think this is one where I love a big book, and I'm going to sing praises of this book's length because it's one where this family is so charming. And because it's a big book, you just spend more time with them. I found myself after I finished reading being like, oh, what about Dickie? What about they become like your family. They become like your home that you return to. Like you read this book, then you have to go live your life, and then you come back to this book and it's, oh, I'm returning to my family members. I really connected with this book in that way.
And the thing too about the structure, moving from one character to another, I missed those characters when they were gone. Like when Molly Bloom's radio hour was over, I missed Imelda. I missed the kids. But the other thing that I found really moving about this, and I agree, Adjei, I found them totally charming and lovable, and I was totally in their stories with them, right? But there's so much tragedy that these people are dealing with, and this was never a book that felt like it was going to steer you towards a happy ending, and they're charming in spite of that. And I think the way they deal with this total collapse that they're grappling with is also what makes this such a moving story as well.
I agree. Speaking of the structure, I mean, it's not just that Murray kind of toggles between these lengthy interior portraits of each of the four family members. I also felt from the beginning to the end that it was like this gradual, and it's a long book, so pretty gradual zooming motion of zooming in. At first, you see this kind of conventional picket fence, middle class, maybe upper middle class, white family in a suburb. And the father, the problems are quotidian. The father is dealing with troubles at work. His wife seems, I'd say, bratty. She wants to keep up appearances socially, and she doesn't want people in the community to know that they are, losing their fortune. And the kids just have their normal high school, middle school issues. And then the further you go, again, it is this kind of slow drip. You just get, the window opens up and you really understand these souls that are really deep beneath the veneer of any just regular family. And I found it so mesmerizing. It's I forgave it. It's some soap opera elements, but you're in it. It's so literary. It's like a Franzen kind of portrait of a family that is so imperfect, perhaps a little more lovable than Franzen's, but yeah, I agree. I'm also recommending this to everyone. And I did go back and read Skippy Dies after I read this, and another really long book. There's also some stream of consciousness, but I think the structure of Beasting has really been developed. So it is, in my mind, the better book, but Skippy Dies is really worth going back to.
Jumana, you said something that made me, I'm connecting dots that I didn't connect before, but you said that this is like this charming family with a lot of tragedy, and Chain Gang All-Stars was this tragedy with a lot of love in it. So we love that dichotomy.
And actually, this is true of all the books we're going to talk about today. It's just these characters, how are they surviving in unbearable circumstances? That is something that will always move me in a book. I think all the books we're going to talk about today address that in completely different and idiosyncratic ways that I find very persuasive and very resonant.
Let's move from a book that, to use Lauren's phrase, zooms in slowly on its characters, to a book that has incredible scope and pans over hundreds and hundreds of years. Lauren, tell us about the book, Northwoods.
So Northwoods is Daniel Mason's sixth book. It's his fifth novel. He's been at this since 2002. This is as Gilbert said, very sweeping work of historical fiction. And actually, it's a nice transition from Beasting because it does also have a similar kind of baton passing motion of one character's perspective to the next. In this book, it's not different members of a single family. It's actually different inhabitants of a single house in New England over centuries, essentially over the history of America. So as sweeping as it is also a very intimate story. Mason has an incredible gift for uniting what could otherwise feel like a collection of linked stories. But it actually, what's so interesting about this is it's each inhabitant, and I'll go into a few of them in a minute, but each inhabitant, it doesn't really start a new slate. It's not like, okay, I'm going to sell my house and someone else is going to move into it and there's this blank slate and the story starts over. It's really a kind of building palimpsest of stories that accumulate in this house in a very similar way to how history accumulates. You have the Revolutionary War veteran turned apple farmer who settles on this estate and bequeaths it upon his death to his twin daughters, who are possibly my favorite characters. They are fiercely loyal to each other, fiercely loyal custodians of the land until one of the twins starts to feel this kind of gravitational pull beyond the walls of the house. There's the real historical landscape artist, William Henry Teal, who inhabits this house. And this is an epistolary section. He's writing letters to his best friend, a man named Erasmus Nash, an author. There are two beetles mating in a spot of firewood, and their larvae are going to go on to decimate the area's chestnut trees. There's a schizophrenic son. It's a really wide-ranging book, historically, temporally, as well as in terms of genre. And I think what's so moving about this is just how consistently he pulls us into these vastly different stories, and also the continuity of it. As land becomes property and it moves from hand to hand, there's obsession with kind of the passage of time and what on earth does and doesn't last. Obviously, the inhabitants die, but there are some things, some natural elements and some built like stones and inanimate objects that remain. And of course, there is a really, which I love, an element of haunting. These people, once they leave the earth, they don't leave the house. There's a real sense of permanence. And actually, I don't think this is a spoiler to say, but the schizophrenic son, it's like, I had this suspicion, maybe he's not schizophrenic. He was just diagnosed as schizophrenic, but his main symptom was that he sees and hears the house's former inhabitants. So there's so much rich layering, and there's some tradition in this novel and some real experiment. And I think he absolutely pulls it off.
Lauren, you mentioned the book kind of explores what remains, both ghosts and physical, with this house. And that was one of my favorite parts. I feel like this book, there is this real attunement to the earth and to the land that I got lost in. I remember, especially in the first half, when you're following the Civil War soldier who becomes an orchard farmer, I remember thinking like, should I move to the woods and start an orchard farm? Because he's so obsessed with apples, and the way he describes how he is drawn to it and the magic therein, you're like, yeah, I get it. That's going to be me. That's the dream. That's the life. It's really incredible to also read fiction that makes you feel somehow more grounded.
MJ, you're calling in from Maine. Are you not on your apple farm?
One day, Gilbert. Moment? One day. I am in a house in a cul-de-sac at the moment, but
all cul-de-sacs are haunted. We all know this.
True.
Lauren, one of the things I love the most, and you alluded to it, was, again, not only does this span hundreds of years and centuries, but it really goes from genre to genre almost in a way. And I never felt bored at any point. Maybe I was slightly impatient during the interstitials that were like songs or poems. There were a couple times when I was like, all right, I'm going to skip this maybe. But you could move from one to the other knowing now here's the apple farmer story and here is the letter portion. And here are the two sisters that have this amazing and slightly perverse entanglement in their lives. It's always, as you move from section to section, it's just constantly surprising. And it speaks, to me at least, to a mastery of genre that the author Daniel Mason has without it ever necessarily feeling like he is like pastiche or that he's a try-hard and that he's just experimenting with all these things. They feel really lived in.
The other thing that I really appreciated about this book was that all of the swerves in tone and genre and form felt very purposeful. This is not what I would call a showpiece. He's not laboring to show off everything that he has put in his tool belt since 2002, probably longer than that. It was a very thoughtful construction that I think actually mirrored the big themes of the book too. And also, I think that there are aspects of this that really stay with you, like pomomania, which our orchard farmer is diagnosed with. It might be a little contagious. Every time I go to the co-op and see a heritage apple, I get a little excited. So I really appreciated what this story was able to do. And I appreciated the book as a complete object as well. I think it was really successful that way.
So that's North Woods by Daniel Mason. Before I ask the three of you to talk about books that you were really passionate about but did not make the list, I want to mention one more book that's on our list. And again, hopefully our nonfiction critic Jen Zalai will talk about it in an upcoming episode. And this is a book called Bottoms Up and the Devil Laughs, A Journey Through the Deep State by Kerry. Howley. It's a fascinating book. She is a journalist at New York Magazine, and as the subtitle indicates, she writes about the American deep state. She gives you this tour through the American intelligence community through the lens of the way it collects data, its surveillance systems, the way the government is inherently secret and paranoid, and how that has trickled down to this point that we are in when there are so many Americans who just believe inherently in conspiracy theories and share that with each other on social media. It's a very discursive book, but there are some touch points. She writes about several well-known and controversial figures in this space, people like Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and Kerry Howley, incorporates a lot of her own reporting, particularly on Reality Winner, who, if you recall, is the former contract worker for one of the intelligence agencies who passed on a bunch of classified documents about Russia's interference in the 2016 election to the news outlet The Intercept. Reality Winner was eventually sentenced to more than 5 years in prison, which was, I think, the longest sentence ever imposed on a leaker of classified information to the media. So she writes a lot about reality. She writes about these other people. But she also sort of moves in and out. She loops back and forth between people and concepts. She follows a train of thought. She drops it. She picks it up again later. It's almost a pixelated book, and it feels like it mirrors our pixelated reality that we're in now. So it's quite interesting, short, relatively short compared to many of the other books on this list. And it is the final book on our list of 10 best books of 2023. That doesn't mean that there weren't books that we all stumped for in the many conversations we had over months of debates trying to whittle it down to 10. So I want to hear from each of you. What were the books that you wish had made it? I'm going to start with Lauren.
So a book that really has a special place in my heart, and this actually came out really early this year, and because of our process, I read it early. So I read it at the end of probably a year ago. And it has stuck with me since. It is Biography of X by Catherine Lacey. This is her fourth novel. She's also written The Answers, Nobody Is Ever Missing, and Pew. This book to me was just indisputably, I would say, a hugely ambitious work of fiction. It's a fictional biography about a sometimes cruel, very enigmatic artist named X. And our narrator is her widow, X's widow, a woman by the name of C.M. Luca. Their relationship was not an equal one. And the narrator's grief, it's just palpable throughout. It's really tinged with obsession. And without going too deeply into it, X was a very secretive person, artist, never wanted the story of her life to come out. And so really just the whole project in uncovering truths about her late wife, CM's, is in many ways violating her privacy. And so it's this nagging theme of the real inescapable bias of telling any life story, making us question the honesty or even really the purpose of biography, of the entire genre. This book, what's also really cool, it's also an alternative history. X said throughout her life, she's indicated that she came from what is called the Southern Territories, which Lacey has imagined as this kind of fascist country that seceded from America. I believe it was after World War II. And so it's this complete alternate landscape for our contemporary country. There's so much boldness in this conceit, as well as just intense emotion, grief, and the beautiful extremes of her characters. Gorgeous sentences as I believe she's written throughout her career. It's one of my favorite books of the year.
You know, Lauren, in all the weekly discussions in the fall that we have about potential top 10 books of 2023, they never get too heated. People never run too hot. And I would never say that you did at any of these meetings either. But I do recall a feeling, which was, if this book doesn't make the list, and it did not make the list, I'm going to be so disappointed in every single person in this room. That was the feeling that radiated off of you, Lauren.
I think that's why the voting was anonymized. Is that why you did that? Just to protect everyone from me? Yeah, I got pretty passionate about this one. I'll admit.
I love it, and I'm very happy you were able to talk about it. Thank you so much, Lauren. Let us go over to MJ.
I'm going to cheat and squeeze in two. The one book that I stumped for big time was YN, which I spoke about the last time I was on this podcast. So I'm just going to brief synopsis is that this is a book about a woman who becomes obsessed with a member of a K-pop band, and she uproots her life to find him. So it's a story of obsession, but it's really about the things we grasp onto to find meaning in our lives and to understand ourselves. So that's YN. Go listen to the past episode of the podcast to talk about why I loved it so much, but I really did stump for it hard. But the other book I wanted to talk about is Big Swiss by Jen Began. The short version of this is that it is about a woman who is a transcriptionist for a sex therapist in a small town upstate. And she, through her transcribing, becomes obsessed with this woman that she doesn't really know. She just, through her voice, starts calling her Big Swiss because she gathers that she has this larger than life personality and is very beautiful, and Swiss because she believes she's Swiss. And she becomes obsessed with this woman. And then one day she meets her at the dog park. She recognizes Big Swiss's voice. And then they start this illicit love affair. And again, I don't want to say too much, but the thing I loved about this book is that it's really fun. I finished reading this book and I was like, that was fun. And then a week later, I was like, I'm still thinking about that. That was really fun. I recommended it to so many people when I'm like, are you looking to get lost in a book that's truly wild? Because the things that happen in this book, the amount of lying and scheming, there is probably the world's worst therapist ever who just wants all the attention himself. At one point, I think Big Swiss says, no, we don't have to do a sound bath at this appointment. Like he's truly an awful therapist, but it's just delightful. It has this naughty, oh, don't do that thrill in every single page of the book. And I loved it. My cheat 2 books are YN and Big Swiss.
Also, great cover, Big Swiss.
Phenomenal cover.
Thank you so much, MJ. Jumana, take us home, please.
Okay, I am very excited to talk to you about Loved and Missed by Susie Boyd. This is something, if you like the bee sting, if you're intrigued by the idea of a Commonwealth family with problems that will make you feel things, but you don't have time for 650 pages, you should read Loved and Missed. You should read it anyway. So this novel follows Ruth, who is a teacher. She has an adult daughter named Eleanor, who is an addict. And Eleanor tells her over probably one of the most wrenching Christmas meals in literary history, because it's on a park bench and it's really cold. Eleanor says, I'm expecting. And Ruth decides this is my chance to like really do motherhood all over again. She decides to raise Eleanor's baby as her daughter. And they have this incredibly close relationship. The child's name is Lily. She's smart. She's very savvy. Eleanor is in and out of the picture depending on how she's doing with her illness. But she has this remarkable self-possession. She starts reading the British equivalent of Anne Landers or Hints from Heloise, and she becomes obsessed with call-in shows. And Ruth thinks to herself, like, why is this child getting tips about stain removal? And then she thinks, oh, this is her equipping herself for life. The writing is beautiful in this book. I was sobbing on the beach. Again, I like books about single mothers. I will read anything about a single mother, particularly if she has a daughter. So I am really showing myself on Maine here. But I think
this is not therapy, Jumana.
I'm not. I don't think nothing about this is healing. Just
it is. It's therapy.
As I was saying, no, I do. It's actually funny you bring that up because Susie Boyd has worked as a grief counselor. And I think that is what allows the emotional resonance of this book to be so clear. And fun fact, she is Lucian Freud's daughter, and which makes her a descendant of Sigmund Freud. And anyway, I love this book. I've told almost everybody I know about it to like thousands of people I don't know about it. I think everybody should read it.
Wonderful recommendation, Jumana. And I think that's the end. I think we got through all of our top 10 books of 2023. Thank you so much to the three of you for coming on to talk about the books you love, the books you're passionate about, and we look forward to doing this again next year. Jumana, thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert.
Lauren, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
MJ, always wonderful to see you. Have fun with the apples.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's always fun to talk about books with you.
Those were my conversations with several of our editors about our 10 best books of 2023. We hope that one or two of those books, maybe more, sound up your alley and that you'll buy them, you'll check them out of your local library, you'll gift them to someone this holiday season. We'd love to hear what your favorite books of the year have been. You should find our article online at nytimes.com and leave your picks in the comments. On our next episode, should our plans hold, we'll have a roundtable discussion with our staff critics, Dwight Garner, Alexandra Jacobs, and Jen Zalai about their years in reading. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you, as always, for listening.